We're The Point, a church that loves God, loves people, and loves life. If you're interested in learning more about us, please go to our website, thepointva.com. Thanks for listening.
Thank you, Pastor Gabe and Point Church family. It is an honor to be here with you guys again, especially on your Reach Sunday, but it's just an honor to partner together with you guys to impact so many lives around the world. You know, about a year and a half ago, I came home one day and I found myself locked out of the house. Now, at the time, we were living in an apartment. Our teenage son was still home. And the apartment door had like this one lock that you could only lock from the inside. You know those kind of doors? And if you lock that, then the key won't unlock it. So I came home, tried my key to open the door, and couldn't. And I realized he must have locked accidentally that lock. So I started knocking on the door. I knew he was home. We had just talked about 45 minutes before. But I kept knocking, and there was no answer. I knocked and knocked some more. Again, no answer. So I picked up the phone. I started to call his cell phone. Again, I called over and over again, no answer. Now, you moms and dads of teenagers know that if we don't answer their call in like 5 seconds, you get a text in all caps, "Mom, where are you?" But getting them to answer their phone, totally different story. So this went on and on. I finally resorted to calling my husband, who's here this morning, and he was hours away at the time, and he started calling him. Again, no answer. I even went next door to our neighbors. I thought, well, they share a wall with his bedroom. Maybe if he fell asleep, they can bang really hard on the wall and wake him up. They're not home. So this goes on, maybe 20 minutes or so, and I'm starting to get worried. It was the middle of the pandemic. He had told me earlier in the day he kind of wasn't feeling well, and my mind just started to race. So after exhausting all of these efforts, my husband's on the line, and he says, "Noel, you know what you need to do?" He said, "You need to go next door to the fire station and ask for help." See, we lived right next door to a fire station at the time. And my first reaction was like, oh, no, that's too embarrassing. But then that mom panic took over, and I thought, I don't know what else to do. So I walk over to the fire station, I peek in, and they're all kind of sitting at the table enjoying a nice meal together, and I knock on the door, and as soon as they come to the door, I turn into a crazy lady. I'm like, oh my gosh, I don't know what to do. My son's not responding. We live right next door. We're on the 3rd floor. Can you help? And in a matter of seconds, there was a full mission formed. They all jumped up. They backed that fire truck out of the garage. They pulled this huge ladder off the truck. There's some guy running around with a tool in his hand saying, "I can break down your door if I need to." They were on it. And just as they were leaning that ladder up against the building and the guy was climbing to the 3rd floor bedroom window of my son, right as he got to the very top, out popped my son on the balcony looking at us like we all have just lost our minds. He had fallen into a deep teenager sleep like they can only do, put his phone on Do Not Disturb, and did not know anything was going on. And literally, I think the first words out of my mouth was, "I'm going to kill him." And I thought, maybe that's not the best idea in front of all those first responders. But seriously, I was like half relieved, half embarrassed. And I remember I just looked at the guy who looked like he was the one in charge, and I said, "I am so sorry." And I remember he just looked back at me casually and said something like, "That's okay. This is what we do." And I've thought about that ever since, because living next door to that fire station, I saw what they did every day. I saw the constant training, the constant preparation, that they would back that truck out. They'd wash it and clean it. They'd roll the hose out to make sure it was working properly. They were always preparing for the next emergency. And why? Because that's who they are. That's what they were made for. That's what they do. And the same has been true for the World Help family all these years as we provide help for today and hope for tomorrow to people in need around the world. Why do we do that? Because that is what we are called to do. If there's anything I've learned in all these years of humanitarian work, it's that if you want to bring about wholeness in the world, you have to love people wholly. Amen. If you want to bring about wholeness in the world, you have to love people wholly. It's what we mean when we say help for today and hope for tomorrow. You see, we believe that without food and clean water and medicines that our bodies need, well, then faith, it means very little. But without faith that feeds our souls, then everything else is just a short-term fix. It's when you focus on both body and soul that we see true transformation in people's lives. And we've seen this over and over again around the world. It's like an African head of state once told us. He said, you can't minister to dead people. You can't do health care to dead people. You can't educate dead people. You have to have them alive first. It's like another partner told us. He said, hunger has no religion. You see, I've seen it over and over again in my work that when you give someone what they need to survive another day, deeper hungers emerge. A hunger for belonging, a hunger for community, a hunger for God's word and his ways. And guess what? Both hungers matter to God, and both hungers should matter to us. I love what the Message version of 1 John 4, 20 through 21 says about our love for God being tied to our love for our neighbors. It says, if anyone boasts, I love God, and goes right on hating his brother or sister, thinking nothing of it, he is a liar. If he won't love the person he can see, how can he love the God he can't see? It says the command we have from Christ is blunt. Loving God includes loving people. You've got to love both. See, for our love for God to be real, we have to love our neighbor. We have to love both. You know, a lot has changed since World Help began more than 30 years ago. In the very early days of World Help, 36% of the world survived on $1.90 a day or less. Today, that's down to 9%. 35,000 children under the age of 5 died every day from preventable causes. We're talking hunger, disease, lack of clean water. Today, that number has shrunk by more than half. And millions more people have access to the Bible due to increased distribution and digital availability. And you see, in the face of so many problems facing our world today, it is easy to convince yourself that there is nothing you can do to make a difference, but it simply isn't true. The numbers prove that it isn't true. And the World Help family has been a part of that. Point Church, you have been a part of that. And I wish I had time to list all the ways you are transforming lives around the world, but here are just a few. You have transformed an entire village in Guatemala, and you've already moved on to your second village. You provided food bags at critical times, especially during the pandemic, to those families in the villages to help them survive. You're helping sponsor the children in those communities to make sure that they can succeed. You've sent 8 containers of food and supplies and hygiene items to Cuba. 6 of them have already arrived, and those containers are providing 1 million meals. You're giving 75,000 people the supplies they need. And one of the cute pictures they're going to show is a group of kids that have new sandals on because of the containers that you guys have sent. Those are some of the supplies that were in that. But what you need to know about those kids is they represent a larger group of about 100 kids that are in a program we're working with there in Cuba, run by a pastor and his wife. And every Sunday, those kids come to church. And when they come to church, they want to feed them a meal using the supplies you guys have sent. And the reason that meal is so important is because those kids only get 1 meal a day during the week, and that's when they go to school. Well, on the weekends, they're not at school, so they rarely eat. So you can imagine how important that 1 meal is that you're helping to provide. But you didn't stop there. You're helping support 145 Cuban church planters. You guys, members of your congregation, you have traveled to these places and more. You are doing so much to transform so many lives around the world. I could go on and on about our partnership together, but all this progress that we're seeing, all of these lives changed around the world, to me, that's not a reason to stop. That should be motivation to keep going, right? Because the world may continue to change, but our mission will not. Because this is what we do. I read in a devotional, it was called Beyond Saving Souls, something that has really just stuck with me. And in it, it said this: in the Gospels, Jesus used the word save or saved less than 10 times. But by contrast, he referred to his coming kingdom more than 150 times. It goes on to say, in our churches today, we talk a lot about saving souls and very little about what Jesus called the kingdom of God. This is startling because it is the exact opposite of what we see Jesus emphasizing in the New Testament. In Matthew 24:14, Jesus said that it is the gospel of the kingdom that will be preached in the whole world, not the gospel of individual salvation. The gospel is not just good news for our souls, it is good news for the world. Did you catch that? The gospel is not just good news for our souls, it is good news for the world. He goes on to quote Tim Keller, who said, the ultimate purpose of Jesus is not only individual salvation and pardon for sins, but also the renewal of this world, the end of disease, poverty, injustice, violence, suffering, and death. And I love that because in a nutshell, that's why World Help exists. That's why I'm standing here in front of you. That's why I do the work I do, because the gospel should be good news for the world. I met Bruce and Malika and their family at the end of a long, dusty road in Zambia. It was the middle of the pandemic, and to be honest, on that day, I really just thought I was meeting another family living in extreme poverty. But I couldn't have been more wrong. Bruce and his wife and 3 kids, they stood in front of us sharing their story, and they were standing in front of their modest home and property that, to me, still looked like it needed a lot of work, but you would have never known that from Bruce. He spoke with such pride and passion about the life that he had created there. And you see, Bruce lived right across the street from an empowerment center that the World Help Family supports. And through that center, he and other families in that community had received the help and supplies they need, especially during the pandemic. But not just that. Bruce had also learned important skills through that empowerment center about farming and agriculture, and he had his own water system on his property to irrigate his crops so that his kids didn't have to walk across the busy street to go find water. He was growing his own crops. He had solar power. He was raising rabbits, and he had created this sustainable life that was a beacon of hope to the other people in this community of what is possible. And he spoke with such pride and was so grateful, praising God for the help that he received. And at the end of our visit that day, his wife came up to me and she handed me this little plant. And she wanted me to plant it in front of the Empowerment Center to kind of commemorate our visit there. And I had no idea. It was so little I couldn't tell what it was, but I found out I was planting a lemon tree that would one day produce beautiful fruit. You see, I read later that a lemon tree was viewed by the early Christians as a sign of hope. Hope for the future. And I realized in that moment that it's not about the handouts, it's not about the supplies, it's not about the farming or the irrigation or raising rabbits. No, it's about hope and how our lives are changed when we have it and absolutely destroyed without it. You see, the gospel should be good news for the world. I met a group of church planters in Uganda that had been praying for years for one thing, a bicycle. You see, these church planters had formed like a co-op of sorts, and they helped each other in these communities. They each represented a different congregation in a different geographical area, but they had to reach all of their people by foot. And then the pandemic happened, and it made it even more difficult because just like us, churches, everything went into lockdown. The people couldn't come to the church. So not only did they need to reach them to minister them, but they needed to reach them to give them the supplies they needed to survive. So this was a really big need. And so I can't tell you the excitement of being there with a truck full of these bicycles to give these church planters. And I had the privilege of helping pull them down and present to them each one at a time. And as they came up to receive their bicycle, spontaneously, one after another, they lifted their fist up in the air and they shouted, "Hallelujah!" Just so excited to receive a bicycle. I cannot duplicate the energy, so I'm going to show you a real quick clip.
Hallelujah!
So multiply that by about 20 and you get the idea, over and over again. But one of those church planners shared this. He said, "We've been walking on foot and now the work has been simplified, and it means God is at work. You boosted it. And as the churches are closing down, we are going to use these bicycles to reach people, to go where they are in their home places. Thank you very much. You are spreading the gospel far from where you are now. God bless you." You see, the gospel is good news for the world. Crossing the border into Ukraine was a surreal experience, knowing that you were in a country that was at war. And we drove to a high school, a former high school. The schools were shut down. And at the time I was there was about 230 people being housed as like a refugee center in this high school, mostly women and children. The other part of the school was being used to make bulletproof vests for the war. And when I was there, the children were still able to receive 3 meals a day, but the adults were down to 1 because they simply didn't have the resources. I met Marina and her 2 granddaughters. They had fled right after the war, had been living at this center. They left her husband and the girl's father behind. They came from an area called Bucha that might sound familiar to you. It's the area in Ukraine where the atrocities that have happened there have been compared to genocide. And so when I'm talking to Marina and asking her about her story and, what it must be like to hear of those things going on in your hometown, she just started to cry. I can't imagine that helpless feeling. I met another young girl named Lisa. Her story, to begin with, was so relatable. She told me how she just had a nice family dinner together with all of her family one night. She went to bed just like normal, and she wakes up the next morning to the sound of bombs going off. Her family flees to the safety of a subway station. They stay there for about a week until they know they have to get out. And she told us the harrowing story. You guys remember the early days of the war, seeing those images of those train stations. And her dad and brother literally had to push Lisa, her sister, and her mom onto the train because it was so packed to make sure that they could get on. She pulled out a little video from her phone that she took out that train window of saying goodbye to her dad and brother, knowing that they may never see each other again. She was overcome with emotion. You see, I could tell you story after story like that. The effects of this war are going to last for generations. And what we have to remember is that as this is becoming a bit of old news for us, it is not old news for the people living through it. You've seen the more recent stories on the news, how it's so cold, they've lost electricity, which means they don't have heat, they don't have water. So there's this new wave of people coming across the border who thought they could stay. They were determined to stay, but for the safety of their kids, they've had to decide to leave. I was there just a few weeks before Christmas and met some of those people. I met this young mom who fled with her child, and I talked to her and heard her story and all that she's been through, and I told her about the people back home that are helping, and I said, what would you want them to know? What would you want people back in the States to know? And she simply just said, I hope and pray you never have to experience what we are going through. There was another mom that day in the refugee center that had recently come over. She had 3 kids, but 2 of those kids have special needs. That would have been a difficult journey, even at home in Ukraine, but at least she had family and friends and school and resources. Now she's in a foreign country with language barriers, limited resources at best. She told me she was so desperate that she literally made the choice to go by herself back to Ukraine so that she could go home and get the books and developmental tools that she used to educate her kids. That's how desperate she was. While she was there, bombs start going off, electricity is cut out, she's hiding in a bomb shelter. The trauma of those few days were so intense. She was telling me how much weight she lost just in a matter of 3 days. This is what people are living through. But here's the thing. As hard as those stories are to hear, I can also tell you about the hope. I can tell you about how all of those people are receiving the help that they need through the World Help family, the food, the clothes, the warm blankets, the coats that they need, the Bibles, and so much more. And that help is giving them the hope they need until they can once again return home. You see, it's like one of our partners in Ukraine told us. He said, "We are praying for a miracle. We are expecting a miracle. But until that miracle comes, we can do small miracles for refugees every day." I stood on the ground of Auschwitz last year, what was once the largest of the concentration camps. And being there at any time would be difficult, right? But being there knowing that miles down the road war was raging on made me look at it a bit differently. And when you're there standing on the ground, you feel this overwhelming responsibility to the words, "never again." And on one of the visits, I was with some Ukrainian friends and partners, and walking through Auschwitz and seeing it through their eyes is a bit haunting. There's a plaque there that says these words, "Forever let this place be a cry of despair and a warning to humanity." You see, I believe history is going to judge us on how we've responded to our action or our inaction. And I want to be on the right side of history. I want to be on the right side of humanity. But more than anything, I want to be on the right side of my faith. Because if the gospel isn't good news for refugees fleeing for their lives from Ukraine, it isn't good news at all. The gospel should be good news for the world. Amen. There's a quote I've always loved by Mr. Rogers, of all people. It'll be familiar to you. Remember, he used to talk about how when he was growing up and he would see scary things on the news, his mom would always tell him to look for the helpers. You will always find people who are helping. And if you follow World Help, you might see us wearing these vests on the field sometimes, especially in Ukraine or a place where there's another disaster that has happened. You'll see other aid organizations, right, wearing different vests like this. Sometimes your parking team may wear vests like this, or your local Chick-fil-A drive-thru may wear vests like this, right? Well, why do we wear them? Why do we wear these vests? Because it's a visible sign of who we are and what we do. And to people in need, it's a visible sign of help and hope. You see, today, as I look out on the Point Church family, I see a room full of helpers, first responders to the needs of the world, both here, right in your backyard, and all around the world. And the truth is, I don't have time to list all the ways you are making a difference, but I can tell you this. The Point is on the front lines, responding with help and hope all around the world. And as you celebrate today, all the lives that have been changed in 2022, I hope you'll also look forward at what God is calling you to do next, because you have so many opportunities. In the lobby today, you can sign up to go to one of these places we've talked about this morning. You can choose to continue to give generously, to make sure that those families in Guatemala, that those villages are transformed, that those sponsored children continue to have what they need, that those people in Cuba can have the food and resources that they need. You can choose to continue to be on the front line, so when the next crisis happens, whether it's here in your own backyard or around the world, the Point Church will be there providing help for today and hope for tomorrow. And why? Because as the Church of Jesus Christ, as people of faith, as the World Help family and the Point Church family together, this is what we do. Before I leave you this morning, I want to share one last thing. I visited this really small church in Romania, right on the other side of the Ukrainian border. It was a church of 35 people. But that church did not let their small size determine their impact. And when war broke out and refugees started fleeing across that border, they didn't turn a blind eye. No, they jumped into action. And that little church of 35 took in more refugees than they have church members. They took in 74 people. These are 5 families, large families, made up of biological children and foster children that they took in while they were in Ukraine. These were among the most vulnerable of children. They had already been separated from their biological families. Now they've lost their home. But this church took them in. They cared for them in their basement until they could find housing donated by the church family in the community. And when we were there, we got to spend a day with them and help pass out supplies and hear their stories and play with the kids. It was a great day. But my favorite part was the end of the day when we all gathered together in that little church. It was a Sunday night, and we were able to worship together. And let me tell you, that little church was busting at the seams with the 35 people and the 74 refugees, and I had a group of women there from America sitting in the front row. And the Romanian pastor, got up to the podium, and the piano was playing in the background, and it was a familiar song. I couldn't quite place it at first. And he stood up in front of everybody, and he said, "In Romanian." And the voices of those 35 church members started to sing this song, of course, in a different language. And it took me a minute, and I realized they were singing, "What a friend we have in Jesus. All our sins and grief to bear. What a privilege to carry everything to God in prayer." And then he said, "In Ukrainian," and the voices of those 74 people that had fled for their lives filled the room, singing lyrics like, "Oh, what peace we often forfeit. Oh, what needless pain we bear, all because we do not carry everything to God in prayer." And then he said, "In American." And I wish you could have seen my face, and the whole row of people panicked, pulled out our phones, frantically trying to pull the lyrics up to this song we haven't sung in so long. One of the ladies leaned over and said, "I think this is an Alan Jackson song." I was like, no. We pulled it together, and we sheepishly started to sing the lyrics of "Have we trials or temptation? Is there trouble anywhere? We should never be discouraged. Take it to the Lord in prayer." And in one moment, the nations came together singing "What a Friend We Have in Jesus," and it was powerful. I read later that hymn was originally written as a poem in the 19th century by a struggling immigrant. He was living in another country. His life was marked by tragedy. He lost not one, but 2 fiancés who passed before he could get married. He ended up devoting his life to the poor. He was called the Good Samaritan where he lived. And he wrote that poem that would one day become a famous hymn and sent it to his mother that was dying in another country. And I thought about the refugees in the room that day as we sang that song, how they've had to flee a country, how they've left loved ones behind, how they've lost loved ones, and yet, what a friend. What a friend we have in Jesus. And you see, I believe that friend we have in Jesus is calling us to be a friend to others too. Because together, this is what we do. Ooh.